All right. Well, thank you everybody for being able to join today. I'm Jake Barnes. I'm a grad student at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. And today we are very lucky to have three great presentations on new approaches to examining bargaining strategies and the sources of worker power. First off, I'd like to give a big thanks to Johnny Kallas for organizing this panel. He'll also be presenting as part of it. All three of my colleagues presenting today are graduate students at the Cornell ILR School. We'll first hear from Dave Blatter, and then Dongwoo Park, and then Johnny will give our third presentation. We have short bios for each of them listed in the box file. I won't go over them now just to give them as much time as they need for their presentations, but if you'd like to learn a little bit more about them, you can go onto our sessions box folder and find that there. Since we have three presenters, each presentation will be around 15 minutes. We will hold Q&A until the end. Feel free to be active in the chat as well, and I'll try and pull questions that I can at the end to kick off the Q&A. With all that being said, I'll yield the remainder of my time and I'll turn it over to Dave to kick us off.
There, I should be unmuted now. Okay, there we go. Thanks, everyone. I'll try to keep this as brief as possible. I think I'm running the risk of going over time. My name is Dave Blatter. The presentation today will be entitled Power from the Periphery, Inter-Union Power Resources and Solidarity. So this project started with a snapshot of two campaigns with similar origins but very different trajectories. Both were minimum wage campaigns initiated and led by small unions representing workers in unstable, precarious jobs. In Korea, this campaign led to the picture on the left, with Kim Young-min, the president of the small Korean youth union, shaking the hand of the chairman of the Korean Minimum Wage Council as he takes one of 9 seats as a labor representative on the council. The youth union had started the campaign for a radically higher minimum wage, and despite the small size and bare-bones organization, they were now at the bargaining table setting national policy on minimum wage. The picture on the right shows activists in Japan conducting street protests outside of McDonald's in Tokyo in coordination with the Fight for 15, holding signs saying, in English, "Fight for 1,500 yen and a union." The campaign, led by small community unions, was pushing for a similarly radical increase in the minimum wage, and yet despite having large membership and funds in the Korean Youth Union and gaining some media attention, the campaign for a higher minimum wage had no support from the main Japanese union confederation, Rengo, and was locked out of the Japanese Minimum Wage Council and any access to policy. Instead, they had tied themselves closely to the Fight for 15 and the American Minimum Wage Campaign. So the main question is, how do these campaigns end up on these starkly different trajectories? And I'm not particularly interested in the increase in the minimum wage, although that is an interesting question on its own, but rather the full support and access to policy bodies that these peripheral unions got in Korea and the total lack of support and access from core unions that these similar unions got in Japan. And a sub-question, why did the Japanese campaign tie itself to the Fight 15? Okay, so in brief, my answers are that one, peripheral unions in Korea had access to potent symbolic power, which similar unions in Japan lacked. And two, that core unions in Korea felt a threat to their legitimacy that core unions in Japan simply did not. The reason this matters and what we can learn from these cases is that I hope to be able to add to our expanding understanding of union responses to the expanding sector of precarious workers, or as the literature puts it, dualization. And I think we can add 2 things to this. One is that we must understand the broader labor movement dynamics to understand any union responses. And 2, that peripheral unions are a key part of that broader labor movement. They can wield unexpected influence given that they can provide something that core unions need. So briefly, there's a roadmap for the presentation. So I will be covering the cases really briefly in a second. I'll go over some key parts of the literature that I hope to be able to add to. I'll be talking about our findings and then how we can add to the literature given those findings. So the first thing I want to talk about is why these 2 cases. So these cases allow us to focus on several key differences because there's a lot about the campaigns that is very similar. So both campaigns were operating within very similar institutional framework in terms of how the minimum wage is set. So both are set by national tripartite minimum wage councils that include members from the major labor confederations, employers associations, and government representatives. And both countries face, in broad strokes, a similar labor movement structure in that they have two large confederations that are divided by ideology. In Japan, this is Rengo and ZRR. In Korea, this is FKTU and KCTU. I want to point specifically to Rengo and FKTU, which in this case are important because they are what are usually seen as conservative, a little more business-oriented union confederations, as opposed to ZRR and KCTU, which are the more working class-oriented confederations. And in both countries, there are similar peripheral unions, some very small unions that are explicitly organizing workers on the periphery in precarious settings and are very different and are separate from the confederations. And in both countries, a very key here is that the major labor confederations had a monopoly on council seats in the minimum wage council, so that the access to policy setting was entirely monopolized by these larger labor confederations. And I'll go over dualization in a second, but in both Korea and Japan are good examples of dualized economies, increasingly so, and in both places, the minimum wage is a social issue. So of course, both countries have their unique, very different histories, and there's a huge amount of differences here, but there are some very key similarities that we're able to hold constant across these cases that allow us to focus on interesting differences. So a very brief timeline of the Korean case here is that, so the Youth Union was founded in 2011, starts the most recent minimum wage campaign. By 2014, they had won the support of both major labor confederations and had been granted seats. Both of these confederations had given up one of their seats, one of their 4 or 5 seats, to give it to a peripheral union. And by 2017, all presidential candidates had pledged to back the Youth Union's campaign of 10,001. So this was, seen as a complete success, both in terms of the minimum wage going up, but also in terms of a very small union being able to have influence, set the national debate about minimum wage, and actually have access to policy setting. Meanwhile, in Japan, we have a very different story, where the campaign starts somewhat later, but is run by the Tokyo Youth Union and community union supporting them. And by 2018, ZRR, the kind of the more left-wing labor confederation, adopted 1,500 yen as a target. By 2019, in a similar sense, the LDP, the conservative ruling regime in Japan, is starting discussions of a national minimum wage, so making every the standards the same and raising the minimum wage significantly. And yet, despite that, the Rengo, the major labor confederation, has done nothing to support this campaign, has an extremely low target, and has said nothing about giving up any seats on the minimum wage council. So we see a stark difference here, not only in terms of the outcomes, but in terms of the support that these kind of conservative unions are lending to this minimum wage campaign. So very briefly, I want to talk about some key literatures here that might make sense of this. And the first one is dualization theory. So dualization is simply the theory that explains the phenomenon of an increasing divide between workers in what's called the core and workers in the periphery. I know I've been bandying these words about. What this means is that workers in the core are generally defined as workers who are in secure employment with a path to promotion and wage increases, as well as benefits, whereas workers in the periphery are usually in insecure, temporary, part-time positions that do not provide them a career path and that lock them out of the secure core. Japan and Korea are clear examples of this trend, with a small core and an expanding peripheral sector of workers that are locked out of security in terms of their employment. But important to our question here, dualization theory predicts, does not only talk about this phenomenon, but to predict something about unions' responses to this. So first of all, it predicts that unions will struggle to organize workers in the periphery, that unions have been focused on core workers in manufacturing specifically, and that the periphery presents a struggle in terms of organizing, and they will simply fail to do this. And then because of this failure to organize the periphery, dualization theory predicts that there will be a divide in interests. The unions will protect their members' interests, the interests of the core workers, oftentimes at the expense of peripheral workers. That they will form partnerships with management in order to protect the security and the benefits that core workers enjoy, oftentimes using peripheral workers as a cheaper form of labor or a form of flexibility. There's been a lot of literature focusing on cases where this is not the case, however. It's true that sometimes unions do act in exclusive ways, focusing on their members, but it's also true that unions often act in inclusive ways, prioritizing the interests of peripheral workers. So the question becomes, what determines when unions will be inclusive or exclusive? And I don't mean this in terms of a broad labeling unions broadly as inclusive or exclusive per se, but also as in terms of individual strategic decisions. What determines whether a union will act in an inclusive or an exclusive way? This can be in terms of organizing, bargaining, political activism, etc. The main explanation that I want to focus on here is the power resource argument, which draws on the larger power resource literature, but basically says that unions have a wide range of strategic choices, and when they decide how to respond to dualization, it's based on protecting or expanding their power resources. So if a union feels a severe threat to their ability to organize and their associational power, they might choose to become closer with management, form a partnership and protect their members, or they might choose to organize the periphery and try to reverse their declining associational power. And so there's a variety of different forms of power that unions may turn to as they face threats due to dualization. So I believe that we can add to this argument that both power resources can help explain something of what's going on in these cases, but that it falls a little short of explaining everything, and that we can add something to this literature as well. So very briefly, the data comes from 35 semi-structured interviews with leaders of core and peripheral unions in Japan and Korea, mostly focused in Seoul and Tokyo, but a range of locations, as well as observations of union activity and campaign material. So our main findings are that the reason the Korean unions decided to act inclusively and give access to these peripheral unions was because they felt a threat to their legitimacy. As one union leader put it, the way people attack us went from red baiting, saying we're too militant and strike too often, to criticizing us for being labor nobility, that we only care about well-off workers and have no connection with younger or non-standard or women workers. So the KCTU and FKTU felt clear threats to their legitimacy as a labor movement and as a political force in Korea because of their inability to organize peripheral workers and the fact that they were representing mostly core workers. This presented a threat to their access to policy bodies and their influence with the government, as well as their ability to organize more workers. In response, they turned to these peripheral worker unions, like the Korean Youth Union, because they could offer a potent source of symbolic power as a panacea to the threat to their legitimacy. As one leader put it, I think the youth movement is really important. I think a lot of the older generation was critical of young people now, that they weren't politically active. So when you had someone saying we are representing youth specifically, we are a youth union, that got a lot of attention from the unions and the media and politicians. So this youth union in Korea was able to draw on a potent source of symbolic power from the role that youth and student movements played in the push for democracy in Korea in the late 80s. That is still a relevant and recent source of power. And as workers organized specifically as a youth and as a youth union, that gained a lot of attention and a lot of support from unions because they saw that as really important to countering the kind of threat to their legitimacy and the fact they're being viewed as labor nobility. Alternatively, in Japan, Rengo felt very little threat from ZRR. So as one of the leaders of the ZRR put it, I doubt we would get seats on the council, even if there was a change in government. The CDPJ is closest with Rengo, so I don't think they would invite anybody else. So they saw basically no potential for them to ever gain access to the Minimum Wage Council or national policy setting bodies because Rengo had no threat to it. It was close with both national parties, and it felt there was no possibility of them losing the monopoly on seats, and so there's no reason for them to give it up. And at the same time, these peripheral unions in Japan struggled to find a relevant source of symbolic power. Despite the youth union playing a real role, as one leader put it, there hasn't been a student movement since the 60s or 70s, really. There's nothing at universities today. So there was no recent relevant source of political movement or source of political power that they could rely on or draw upon, because there has been so little student activism over the last few decades in Japan. So really briefly to wrap up, a few things we hope to be able to add to the power resource literature. One is that we must consider dynamics of the labor movement. So the power resource literature usually focuses on unions' power resources vis-a-vis employers, and as those resources are threatened, how they respond. But unions also feel threats to their power resources from each other. So unions can, as they compete over limited associational and institutional power, as KC2 and FK2 competed for workers of the workplace and for seats on the minimum wage council, they felt threats to power resources from each other. They were important in this case for turning both of them to another union for sources of power as well. That unions can also, so it's important to understand also that unions can be sources of power, and they can bargain sources of power with each other in order to protect their legitimacy and reduce threats to their influence. And lastly, that peripheral unions can be important actors. The literature often assumes that unions are, represent core workers, and peripheral workers have no real voice. But there's a variety of new forms of peripheral organizing outside of core unions, and these forms of organizing and organizations can actually have strong influence. And this often relies on symbolic power, whether unions can access and draw upon potent symbolic power that can overweigh the lack of money and organization and resources that these small unions have as they struggle to organize workers in very precarious settings. Hope that was not too jumbled given the shortness of the presentation. There's plenty of limitations going forward, but I'll end it here and look forward to questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. Now we'll turn it over to Dongwoo.
Okay. Yeah. So hi. I'm Dongwoo Park, first year PhD student at Cornell School. So I'm going to talk about my current research titled Two Phases of Union Democracy, which basically discusses the unexpected and contradictory effects of union democracy on their strategies toward precarious workers. So there has been a large variety of studies about iron role of oligarchy by using the cases from labor unions. So their fundamental claim is that as unions get bigger and older, they become more likely to reflect the interests of top union officials that often contradicts with those of rank and files. And also, scholars have pointed out that this bureaucratic structure of unions may exacerbate labor market dualization by protecting only core workers. So on this background, researchers have examined under which conditions unions can be successfully revitalized. Although the term union revitalization is a little bit vague, past research suggests that enhancing internal union democracy and organizing the unorganized are essential parts of the program. However, in my view, these two goals are not necessarily compatible to each other because there's no logical connection between these two. So for example, if union members prefer to protect their vested interest, enhancing internal union democracy will just end up with exacerbating labor market dualization. So therefore, in this study, I intend to investigate whether these two revitalization projects can be accomplished at the same time. So first of all, it should be clarified in the beginning what union democracy actually means. So in the past literature, scholars tend to assume that democratic unions tend to follow the system of representative democracy that is similar to parliamentary system in politics. So in this concept, institutionalization of opposition and leadership's responsiveness to membership opinion are really important. So in other words, whether unions have a competitive election inside and whether there is a formal structure that fosters the communication between union officials and rank and files determine the degree of democracy of union. However, there are competing views about whether democratic unions are more effective or not. So some scholars have argued that competitive environment within a union may enhance its organizational efficiency, while others have also pointed out that it might also lead to inefficiency because of coordination problem driven by diverse and often conflicting interests from various opinion groups within a union. And also, it is difficult to define union effectiveness in the first place. Although previous research measured the effectiveness of unions in various ways, here I used union inclusiveness instead because of its relevance in the context of declining unionization rate. So in this framework, inclusive strategy is those aiming at incorporating different workforce group into representation structure, whereas exclusive strategy refers to those focused on representing only core members. So past studies on union democracy are mostly based on top-down organizing model because those studies tend to use organizing campaign or NLRB election data as a unit of analysis from organizers' perspective. So I think there is a knowledge gap in terms of how existing unions change their previous strategies about vis-a-vis non-standard or peripheral workers. So therefore, it is important to take into account such transformative aspects of labor unions. Well, I think this kind of aspects of unions can be best understood in the system of enterprise unionism, because under this system, new organizing campaign is so rare, which means that representation of previously unorganized group can be mostly possible through organizational change of existing unions. So in this system, bargaining and negotiation occur at enterprise or workplace level because it is assumed in the system that well-being of union members is strongly tied to a firm's economic success. So therefore, in most cases, union members are full-time workers with standard employment contracts because they are considered to share direct interest with management and firms. On the other hand, workers without standard employment contracts, such as temporary or part-time workers, are tended to be excluded from the union membership boundary. Yes. So yeah, I think this kind of exclusion has a long history in Korea. In the past, it was illegal for unions to organize those without standard employment contract, but now it is not illegal for unions to change their bylaws to include and recruit non-standard workers. However, some unions still stick to such old principle, thereby widening the gap between labor conditions of standard and those of non-standard workers. So therefore, there's a large size of workers who are not eligible for joining a union, even though they are directly hired at workplace and firms. And also, I think Korea provides a unique setting for understanding the relationship between union democracy and union inclusiveness, because there is a peculiar dynamic between union confederation and local unions. Although each union at workplace has a relative autonomy, confederation unions still have some power over their member unions through ideological resources. So furthermore, there are two union confederations that are marked by their diverging political ideology. So for example, the Federation of Korea Trade Union, FKTU in short, is generally perceived to be politically conservative or moderate, while Korean Federation of Trade Union, KCTU in short, is liberal and has advocated progressive social and welfare policies ever since it was established. Also, I think that their role in union inclusiveness is really important because internal union democracy is just a formal structure and it should be embedded in this national political context environment. Because these upper level organizations can shape the preferences and aggregate interests of local unions, their role should be incorporated in the framework when we examine the relationship between union democracy and their inclusiveness. So I test this theoretical expectation by drawing upon Korean data set, which is Korean Workplace Panel Survey. It is longitudinal data set, which is surveyed biannually. And I only included workplaces with union. So 720 workplaces as a total were analyzed in my study. And also I used fixed effects model to account for workplace specific heterogeneities. And I also took binary outcome as continuous variable due to its computational efficiency. Yeah, so my dependent variable is union inclusiveness, which measures whether directly employed temporary workers are eligible for joining a union. And for independent variables, I included various kinds of measures for internal union democracy, such as the change in union leadership in the past 2 years and voter turnout in the most recent union leader election. And also I included various controls such as workplace age and union age or density. Yeah, so this table shows the effect of internal union democracy on union inclusiveness without considering the role of union confederation. As you can see, it is a little hard to find meaningful results from this analysis. So I break this down into 4 different categories. So I could see some statistical findings from the 2 columns in the left, which is colored in yellow, which is private sector. Although I couldn't see any significant findings from the analysis of public sector. So briefly speaking, the effect of voter turnout is statistically significant when unions are affiliated with politically moderate confederation. And the frequency of delegate meeting is statistically significant when unions are affiliated with politically liberal confederation. However, the directions of the effects of these variables are negative, which means that union democracy can make unions to stick to exclusive strategies toward temporary workers rather than include them as a union member. So I think this finding is a little bit complicated, not straightforward, because not all measures of union democracy were statistically significant. Also, the effect of union democracy on union inclusiveness dependent on the ideology of union confederation. Furthermore, this finding is, I think it is opposed to conventional wisdom about the role of union democracy in organizing activities. But I think it can be also matter of interpretation whether union delegate meeting or General Assembly does reflect true opinions of rank and files, because there could be some mismatch between union delegates, union officials' opinion and rank and file's opinion. So yeah, so it is pretty much it. So thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Dongwoo. And finally, we'll have Johnny.
All right, thanks so much, Jake. Can you guys hear me? Awesome. All right, thanks so much, everybody. So I'm going to be presenting on the Resurgent strike, nurses and a militant union identity. The title's a little bit of a work in progress, but just in terms of a roadmap, I'm going to start with a quick introduction, then discuss my 3 research questions, talk through my theoretical framework and contribution, also look at my methods and findings, and then finally discuss just a couple of implications. So in terms of background, so after decades of decline, strikes increased in the United States in 2018 and 2019 to the highest level since the mid-1980s. Approximately 90% of strikes in 2018 occurred in the education and healthcare sectors. There's also been a wave of wildcat strike activity in response to the current COVID crisis, largely around health and safety issues. There are a couple of limitations to large-scale strike research. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics only keeps track of stoppages that involve 1,000 or more employees and last a full shift, leaving out many workers who are not employed in large firms. Another problem is that it's very difficult to capture certain strikes like wildcats, though during the COVID crisis, reporter Mike Elk has done a pretty good job at this along with some others. So there's been 3 main research questions that I'm going to look at. First, why do strikes occur? Second, how do workers and their unions sustain militancy beyond temporary episodes of unrest? And third, do strikes serve as a source of union revitalization? So even though representing traditionally labor's strongest weapon, there's surprisingly little research on strikes and militancy, likely due to declining strike rates and also some of the limitations mentioned beforehand. As labor organizations began experimenting with innovative campaigns in response to declining unionization, research on union revitalization proliferated in the late 1990s and 2000s, but rather than looking at strikes as a potential source of revitalization, much of this literature really assumes that strikes are no longer effective and unions need to build power beyond the workplace through strategic campaigns and community coalitions. There's also a number of ways to measure revitalization, including organizing growth, improved contracts, and level of membership activism. Returning to the literature on strikes specifically, there's really 3 main perspectives on strikes within the existing industrial relations research. So first you have kind of the neoclassical perspective, which is based on asymmetric information and labor market conditions leading to strike incidents. There's also a conflict or Marxist perspective, which argues that capitalism inherently creates antagonistic workplace relations that inevitably leads to some level of conflict. Then finally, there's an institutional perspective, which sort of combines these 2 approaches and discusses the various determinants of strike activity. Instead of adopting one of these perspectives on strike activity, I try and distinguish between what I call external and internal determinants of labor militancy that really cuts across these different perspectives. So external determinants include those factors that frame the decision of workers to strike. I'm thinking of labor market conditions, the degree of political incorporation of organized labor, and other institutional frameworks. Internal factors include the processes really related or inherent to strike mobilization. Here I'm thinking of leadership status and union identity. I pay particular focus on the role that union identity, which is really defined as a foundational structure that orients a union towards particular strategies, what role this plays in strike incidents and durability. So moving on to my case, to examine these questions, I look at a series of strikes as part of a contract campaigns or multiple contract campaigns between the California Nurses Association and Sutter Health from 2011 to 2015. CNA represents approximately 85,000 nurses across California, including at 16 of Sutter's 24 Northern California hospitals. There's no master bargaining agreement between CNA and Sutter, so the hospitals bargain separate contracts. Sometimes there will be multiple hospitals as part of the same medical center that'll bargain a single contract. The union did recently win a common expiration date across all these agreements, so that didn't exist in this time period from 2011 to 15. And I focus specifically on the 9 strikes as part of a contract campaign from 2011 to 13 at Alta Bates Medical Center, or Alta Bates Summit Medical Center, excuse me, which is a 3-hospital campus in Oakland and Berkeley, California. And then I also introduce a comparison with a 1-day strike as part of a contract campaign at Sutter Roseville Medical Center in Roseville, California, just outside of Sacramento in 2015. And I'll highlight this later, but I should mention that really all of these strikes are of relatively short duration. Most are one-day strikes with the corresponding 4-day lockout by the employer, which is somewhat common in healthcare, and none of the strikes are longer than 7 days long. Okay, in terms of methods, I took a research trip to Northern California in November of 2019 and conducted 18 semi-structured interviews with union staff, leaders, and rank and file nurses. I was planning another research trip this past April, but obviously due to the COVID crisis, that trip's been delayed. And I plan to conduct more interviews with union staff and nurses, and also hopefully with employer representatives at a later date. I have started to triangulate my findings with data on union contracts along with several other sources. For my argument, I'm really trying to argue that both external and internal factors influence strike incidence and durability, though a militant union identity is especially important in sustaining strikes over time. And I should just say much of the literature really defines militancy as strikes. They're kind of often viewed as one and the same. I think militancy encompasses more than just strikes to include a general confrontational approach to labor relations, but I'm still working on a clearer or even better definition and would appreciate any insight on that if anyone has any. So to begin with, in terms of findings on militant union identity, so until 1993, nurse managers and educators comprised the majority of CNA's leadership due to its affiliation with the American Nurses Association. Some of you may know is a professional organization that really begrudgingly permitted collective bargaining and strikes in California. Staff nurses won control of CNA in 1993 and ushered in a new left-wing leadership that formally disaffiliated from the American Nurses Association in 95. This new leadership was led by Roseanne DeMauro, who was actually a former sociology PhD student and organizer, as executive director from 95 until her retirement in 2018. I think her background is particularly important as well. So CNA vehemently opposes labor management cooperation, especially the Kaiser Labor Management Partnership formed in 1997, really right around this same time period, and has long supported policies such as Medicare for All since the mid-1990s. From a labor relations standpoint, CNA's militancy is evident in its perspective on strikes and other tactics. So multiple interviewees explained that organizationally, CNA views strikes as really the best form of political education. So one respondent commented that, quote, "Striking is quintessential political education for our members. It's the key piece where people have learned more about the relationship between people and capital than any other way. You can't demonstrate that any more than actually living through it. It's a real shift in terms of taking power and control," close quote. And also extending the conception of militancy beyond the strike, CNA utilizes what they refer to as marches on the boss, which are delegations of nurses that collectively confront management during an organizing campaign, a contract campaign, or even pretty frequently an issues-based campaign between contracts. Multiple interviewees stated that these marches on the boss are really expectations at CNA and part of the union's overall organizing program. Okay, in terms of turning our attention to the Ultimate Summit contract campaign, multiple factors, I argue, led to CNA's ability to sustain 9 strikes and fend off over 100 proposed concessions from Sutter in negotiations from 2011 to 2013. So external factors like employer strategies and a favorable organizing context of the Bay Area clearly helped shape the decision to strike. CNA viewed Sutter's bargaining approach as an existential threat to the contract with over 100 proposed concessions, which encouraged even the most anti-union nurses to demand a strike. But I really argue that this militant identity I just explained was especially crucial in this case. Many of the staff and nurse leaders from the 2011 to 13 strikes also helped organize a 1992 strike at Summit Hospital, one of the hospitals involved here, which was a 6-week strike that partially led to the internal revolt at CNA. CNA had an ideological belief in the importance of striking in this time period in 2011 to 13. One interviewee stated that, quote, "CNA had an ideological point of view that the labor movement wasn't using the strike tool enough, and they were going to show its efficacy as a tool, which they did," close quote. These strikes occurred over the course of 2 years and gradually escalated in length from multiple 1-day strikes to a 7-day strike and a final 10-day strike threat that brought a Sutter to the table. The long tradition of militancy by rank and file nurses at Ultimate Summit, dating back to really even before the 1992 strike, combined with a left-wing leadership willing to use the strike weapon, kind of formalized this militant identity and, I argue, contributed to the outbursts of sustained strike activity in this case. finally, in terms of findings on strikes and union revitalization, which is kind of my second or a separate question, I compare the 9 strikes in this case with a single strike at Sutter-Roseville. So I actually find ambiguous results so far at All Debate Summit on strikes as a source of revitalization. In the contract immediately following the strike settlement in 2013, so in the 2016 contract, it was relatively quick bargaining and CNA actually won pretty big gains. But there is some evidence of reduced activism by nurses between contracts. Obviously, it's common for activism to reduce between contracts, but it really is an important feature of CNA's militant unionism to build power across the facility, prepare for the next round of contract negotiations, with sometimes kind of these campaigns that exist in between contracts. So I'd say in general, there's been a reduced level of conflict from both sides, the employer and the union, since the strikes in 2011 to 13. At Sutter-Roseville, there's actually much more direct support for strikes as a source of union revitalization. So this hospital was organized in 1997, so there's less history of militant unionism than obviously the All Debate Summit counterparts. The strike was described as a transformative event by multiple interviewees. The buildup to the strike included agitation around proposed healthcare cuts and a perceived lack of respect towards nurses. Since the strike, there's much evidence of increased activism, most notably including a campaign against workplace violence that featured a petition drive, multiple marches on the bus that resulted in several victories. So in general, I would argue that strikes are an important component of revitalization, though perhaps there might be some evidence that too much conflict could tire a membership. I'll probably need a little bit more data on that from both of these cases. So I just want to highlight a couple of points in conclusion. So there's actually, I recently discovered, there's a recent dissertation by Pablo Gaston, who's now a sociologist at the University of Michigan, in which he examines the historical development of the CNA until the 1990s, kind of leading right into the time period I take up the story at, and makes it clear that rank and file nurses in the Bay Area had a history of militancy before this staff nurse revolt and disaffiliation from the American Nurses Association in '95. So I just want to highlight that I really am trying to argue that the left-wing leadership then cemented this militant identity and extended it to other components of the organization. It's also interesting to note that types of strikes organized by CNA changed considerably around this time in the mid-1990s, from the occasional open-ended strikes in the 70s, late 80s, and early 90s, to more frequent strikes that have become more characteristic over the past 20 to 25 years. And there's another interesting question as to whether the more expansive interpretation of illegal so-called intermittent strikes by the Trump National Labor Relations Board will prevent these short duration strikes that CNA and also other nurse unions utilize. This obviously reinforces the importance of external factors like institutions in constraining militancy. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Johnny. And another thank you to all of our panelists for some really interesting and important research. We have plenty of time at this point for Q&A. I do have, it looks like there's one kind of multi-part question for Dave here, so I'll kick it off with that, but I'll just say, if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand or just send me a message in the chat, and I'll try my best to get everybody in before we close. But again, we have a good amount of time, so hopefully we'll be able to field everybody's questions. So just to get things started, Asaf in the group chat asked Dave about the agency aspect or strategies of the challenges raised from new unions. Are challenging strategies deliberate? Are the challenges directly addressed by the different actors in labor relations? Do you see any alliances among potentially rival unions? And finally, do you analyze the nature of challenge and the reactions of traditional/incumbent unions? So Dave, feel free to kick us off with any comments you may have on any of those questions.
Yeah, all right. Thanks so much for the question, Asaf. Great questions, and I wish I could have gotten into more detail on all of this. So the first point that I want to make is that the challenging strategies were, I want to kind of make a clear point that both the new peripheral unions in Korea and Japan were very clear that they did not view directly criticizing or challenging core unions as productive or something that would work at all. And in fact, they viewed them as very dangerous. And so even in Japan, where Rengo refuses to support the minimum wage campaign at all, there's no open criticism of Rengo. You don't see any actual actions at Rengo. at most you see, some like it's mostly internal criticism, and instead what they focus on is they target the state and try to target public opinion and put implicit or indirect pressure on the core confederations. And so it's also interesting that this is also true in Korea, where even when they gain access to the Minimum Wage Council, it's important to note that while the peripheral unions in Korea, they wanted to, they thought it would be cool, and they used that as a talking point at times that they didn't have access. They didn't criticize KCTU and FKTU directly, and they didn't really think that would happen. In fact, the decision was very strategic by the KCTU and FKTU. They actually talked together. They realized that they would be stronger if they had peripheral unions in the Minimum Wage Council, and that they would be able to deflect criticism. And so they made this decision on their own and then told the youth union and other unions. And so it was very much not like a pressure campaign that eventually led to this. It was kind of a public, minimum wage campaign that these core confederations saw a chance to kind of gain symbolic power from this campaign, and made the choice on their own. And then another really key point that you brought up here is kind of the alliance between potentially rival unions. And this is a really important part of the story that I couldn't cover at all, but in Korea, where you would actually in some ways expect more competition and more strife between the KCTU and FKTU. As a historical note, FKTU was kind of the government sponsored or allowed union during the military regime, and the KCTU is an independent union that formed only after the democracy movement. And so you'd expect some kind of tension there, and it's not that it's not without tension, but they are actually able to work together and collaborate on issues. And part of this is because they share seats on the Minimum Wage Council and other social dialogue bodies, and so they have to collaborate to some extent. And if you compare that to Japan, Rengo won't even acknowledge ZR's existence for the most part. When I was interviewing some of the Rengo leaders, they literally wouldn't say ZR's name to me. They would say that other labor confederation, because there's so much tension and there's so much desire to distance themselves from ZRR that they want nothing to do with ZRR. And so there's no ability for those two confederations to collaborate on anything. Whereas in Korea, that you do see kind of collaboration and alliances, even amidst competition. Hopefully that kind of answered some of your questions there.
Great, thanks, Dave. So I don't think we have any other questions queued up at this point, so I'll just open up the floor to anybody who'd like to ask.
Hey everyone, this is Matt Fisher-Daly. Thanks for the really good presentations. I had a question, general one for any of you who would like to respond, which is whether you see changes in the industries that are organized that you're studying as particularly relevant to the union dynamics that you described. So, there's a lot of discussion these days about either, fishering or the role of technologies. Do you see any changes in the industries that's, influencing the directions of the unions that you're studying? Thanks.
Yeah, so Matt, great question. I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're getting at, but I do think, especially for strikes here in the U.S., the kind of strikes that CNA undertakes, these recent kind of rulings from the National Labor Relations Board can be really significant. And I think there is, I didn't get a lot of data on this because I think they might be hesitant to talk about it, but I'm not sure if CNA could really run these types of strikes that they did a few years ago under the current board ruling. And I think that's really interesting when thinking about constraints on sort of tactics and strategies. So I'm not sure if that totally really answers your question, but I think there's a lot of these external factors that really play a role.
Well, for me, I think technology provides a kind of unique opportunity for unions because there is a variety of platforms that can foster efficient communication between union members. So I think, well, our understanding of union democracy would be change it after some technological development. So I think that is just my first impression with technology. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add to that, Matt. Maybe just that I think it's intrinsic to the broader trend of work moving from the kind of the core to the periphery in dualized settings, where you see, even in the same industry, more work being diverted from core companies to supply chains, or even within the same company, with temp agencies or workers who are hired on temporary contracts. So I think as you see, kind of changes in industries, it's mostly away from the traditionally organized sector, which creates tensions and conflicts and challenges for your unions going forward.
We have a few questions for Johnny in the chat. Justin is asking, do you think this militancy is or can be the new status quo among certain unions and organizations? Is this maybe how they're just going to operate under the US model of labor relations, or is militancy more of a means to an end, in which unions intend to be less militant once conflict decreases? And Shannon asks, to what extent were calls to close the hospital relevant, and how that impacted community coalitions and support?
Yeah, both really great questions. On Justin's question, I think what I'm really trying to argue is that these deep historical legacies really matter. So the legacies of rank and file militancy combined with now the legacies of a left-wing leadership over the past 20 years is really what makes the difference in the case I'm trying to explain. It's also a very kind of institutional case in the sense that I don't think it perfectly represents a lot of the militancy that's going on today, which has been in the form of wildcat strike activity, often against existing union leadership or in totally non-union settings. So I think there is a hope for some more level of activism from the labor movement in general. I would just point people to really think of these deep historical legacies in some unions that are already experiencing this militancy. In terms of Shannon's question, so this is a really good point that I did a practice presentation to someone yesterday, and they brought this up. In terms of the case itself, I think CNA definitely built on support from the community and existing coalitions to save Sutter hospitals in the past, but there's this ongoing threat of the closure of Alta Bates. They hadn't announced that during this time period in 2011 to 13. So that's clearly happening right now. And in some ways, I'm trying to make the argument that these strikes led the employer to consent the power at the facilities to union power, but then at the same time, they're threatening to close one of these hospitals. So I should do more research kind of on that community coalition and campaign that's ongoing. The hospital is not supposed to close for another 10 years, but that's still open to see whether that'll happen or not.
This is Paul Whitehead from Penn State. I've got a question or two for our last couple of presenters. On the negative relationship between democracy and inclusiveness, I wonder if you could expand on why you think that is. Is the idea that in a more democratic union, the member owner, the well-represented member maybe doesn't want to dilute his or her sense of ownership by bringing in newer and maybe worse yet, less well-paid people? Do they see the bargaining power of the union as a sort of limited fund? And gosh, if we let these newcomers in, we're going to have to spend it on their problems. It's just very interesting that you found a negative relationship, and I wondered if you could expand on it. Finally, on Alta Bates, you mentioned strike fatigue, and you mentioned a large number of strikes in a maybe 5 or 6 or 7 year period. Were any of those at particular hospitals seeing more than one strike in that period, where they could say, gee, you came to me just 3 years ago and now I have to strike again? Or were they strikes, each of them for the only one that occurred in your study period? And if it's the latter, that doesn't seem like, real heavy strike activity. but one can always feel fatigue. I just wonder if you could elaborate on that, please.
Thanks for the question. So, I think, you're right. So maybe including too many people with different identities may dilute identities of unions. But I just feel like, well, especially in Korea, such identities of workers may be can be clustered around firms rather than their employment contract. Or so so now I'm thinking about how to incorporate theories of identities into this framework. So yeah, thanks for your suggestions.
Yeah, and on the Ultimate Summit case, I guess I was trying to fit in too much information in a short amount of time. I think this was actually 9 strikes in 2 years at the same 3 hospitals in this case. At the same time, there were 9 strikes at several other hospitals at Sutter, I think, Vallejo, Mills Peninsula, a few other hospitals. There was a tremendous amount of strike activity within these very brief 2 to 4 year period. Depending, you can also extend it to 2015 to encompass Roseville and some Central Valley facilities. So this was a ton of strike activity, and that's kind of what I'm getting at, as you alluded to, strike fatigue. 9 strikes, even of a relatively short duration, in 2 years in response to the same contract demands. It's just an incredible amount of conflict in a short period of time.
Thank you, that helps a lot.
All right, we have just a few minutes left here if anybody has any final questions.
Johnny, was it about staffing?
In 2011-13, one respondent said they tried to basically rip up the entire contract. So it was partially about staffing, but they were trying to reduce, they were trying to eliminate some seniority provisions. They proposed over 100 concessions. It really was a pretty confrontational approach to ripping up what actually is CNA's oldest contract, dating back to just after World War II. So it touched every corner of the contract.
But each time they returned, they came back to the same position, or that's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, so from CNA, I heard they made very little movement. I'm trying to also talk to employer representatives to get a full picture of the story. But from CNA, they basically said they made almost no movement until the final strike threat.
Any final questions in our last couple minutes? All right, well, I guess we'll give everybody an extra minute or two before the general membership meeting. So thank you. I just like, oh,
I think
sorry?
Question from Alex and Victor.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, did any of our panelists have any thoughts on Dean Colvin's bringing up the new NLRB rules on intermittent strikes and Victor's question in regard to Joe Biden?
Yeah, sorry, just very briefly. I think Alex is more of a comment, but I don't want to put words in his mouth. But yeah, I totally agree that that would be a really interesting study to see if these intermittent strikes, that ruling just came down last year. But going forward, it'll be worth tracking. For me in the CNA case, they're going into bargaining with Sutter next year and to see if there will be any strikes coming out of that, but also much more generally. And I don't think I have a good response in 30 seconds to labor law reform. I totally agree that this speaks to the need for it. And I know that a lot of people in the labor movement, including CNA, I think may get more behind Biden than they had in the past because of these recent NLRB rulings. So I don't know that for sure.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists one last time. Dave, Johnny, and Dongwoo, thank you very much. And again, thank you, Johnny, for organizing this panel. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.